Ho ho ho! Merry Christmas! Welcome back to this festive Christmas-themed devlog, all about the new snow mechanic. These take a long time to animate. The snow mechanic is another one of the elemental mechanics in my game that doesn't have a name yet. This is one of the combinations of elements, so there's 4 base elements, and this element is a combination of ice and smoke. Ice is cold, smoke is fluffy, it makes snow. When combining these together, you will transform objects into the snow element. There are 2 uses of this, the first being if the ground object is snow. For this, the ground object is offset slightly and you sink into the snow. The way I managed to create this effect is I will simply just offset the object's collision object, as in the collider, for any object that is turned into snow, making it 0.5 units closer to the ground. However, because game awkward, I will also have a secondary hitbox that handles the object's collision, which is the same as it always would be, so snow objects aren't going to cause any clipping issues with clipping into the ground by being an offset collider. It's just going to have a offset collider that the player can interact with. This is the least interesting aspect of the snow mechanic. The snow grounds are mostly just a funny little aspect. They don't do much. The world butter potatoes or stuff look is the snow player mechanic. As you can cast spells on yourself, if you were to cast this snow spell on yourself, the player would become their snow version. The snowball version of the player is actually one of the more complicated forms that the player can transform into, compared to the puddle form where you become a puddle. The snowball form has a few mechanics behind it. The first being, the longer the player rolls, the bigger their snowball will grow. This is doubly so if they are rolling in a snow object, because they're picking up more snow. But essentially, the snowball is rolling, and it is as if you were rolling a snowball in the real world. The snowball will magically grow as it rolls around more. I know this doesn't make any sense if the player is rolling around in mud, or a cube area, but just ignore that, it looks cool when the snowball grow. The way I achieve this effect is by creating a snowball object when the player turns into a snowball. This has its own collider, and this is what we're going to use when calculating the player's physics when they are turned into a snowball. As the player is moving, if they are still on the ground, we're going to be scaling this object within a degree, and then once it has reached a certain level, it will be the max size it could be, and it won't grow anymore. As the snowball grows, we're going to be incorporating its newfound size in our collision data. We're going to be checking for the floor at the bottom of the snowball, we're going to be checking for collision all around the radius of the snowball, and we're going to check for collision above the snowball. Because if there is collision above the snowball, we're not going to grow anymore, because that causes really easy clipping into objects, and it was easier just to make the snowball not grow instead of fixing that code. Once the player leaves the snowball form, which they can do in a variety of ways, the easiest being just run out the timer for how long the form lasts, the player will be positioned in the center of the snowball, and then they will have some level of logic applied based on this. The way you can think of this is you can imagine the snowball growing around the player, and the actual core of the snowball itself is where the player is contained. So when the snowball breaks, we're going to destroy the snowball, which is the large outer rim, and then in the center of it, we're going to have our player placed there. A fun visual for this is imagining if the player was encased inside of this snowball the whole time, and then the snow has broken, and they have freed themselves from the center of this big snowy mass, falling from it. If the snowball is a large enough size, the player will be set in the air, and they will fall from the snowball. If the snowball is a small enough size, they will just be set on the ground like normal, and if the snowball has collided with something, the snowball is going to break, and we're going to have logic derived from the snowball based on whatever it has collided with. The 2 kinds of objects that can break a snowball are fire objects and water objects for incredibly obvious reasons. If you touch a fire object, the snowball will melt because it's fire, and this causes the snowball to instantly break. An interesting quirk of this, and by quirk I mean thing I deliberately designed and added to the game, is that when touching fire when you're a snowball, the snowball will break and it will actually avoid the player being damaged or hurt and pushed away by the fire, because they have actually been encased in this boundary of the snowball, and they will just be walking like normal unless they are very, very close to the fire. So essentially, if you have a big enough snowball, you can actually use this to avoid some hazards. Probably. I don't know, I haven't designed the puzzles yet. Maybe I'll use this in one. Next is the snowball falling into water or touching water. This is the snowball melting and becoming a slushy little mess of snow. And in this sense, if the snowball is small enough and the player is going into the water, we're just going to set the player into the water as normal because they are basically in the water anyway because the snowball is pretty small. If it is not, we're just going to do the same thing as the fire, and we're going to have the player fall from the snowball as normal and avoid actually colliding with the water because they are too far away based on their centering in the snowball and the snowball being too large. Next we have the actual logic for how the ball rolls itself. I hate to burst your bubble, but it's just regular player movements. There is absolutely no difference to the player's regular movements compared to the actual snowball's movement. The only difference is the size of their collider. I just have a visual of the snowball rolling, and it gives the impression of the ball actually rolling and having physics moving in this sense of movement, when in actuality it is just the player moving regularly and a very convincing animation playing over it. There is one difference to this. I have to have the snowball be able to roll over and up objects. If it's a small enough object, then the growing collider size actually accounts for this and is able to ignore smaller objects and let you roll up them. But when in the middle of the air, I need the player to be able to roll up objects that are in the air and roll up and over objects like cliffs or other surfaces, like a tree or a rock or something else. What I'll do for this is when the player is in the air and a snowball, and also moving, I'll check in front and below them in a slight area based on the size of their snowball. If we have collision in this area, I'm actually going to ignore any amount of gravity falling, and I'll allow the player to defy gravity while there is collision in front of them with the illusion that they're actually rolling up the surfaces in front of them. This is only for a very short amount of time, and the longer this time goes on, the more the player is able to not fight their gravity amount, and they will fall regularly. This actually gives a very nice illusion of the player being able to roll over objects, but in actuality all I'm doing is disabling gravity when there is collision in front of them. Finally, we have the actual visuals. First, let's go over the model. As you can see, this is a 3D snowball, but with 2D face texture to maintain the art style and design of the player character on the snowball. But if we go into Unity, that's weird, the snowball is now flat. So a technique I like to do in 3D models, if I want to give them a flattened effect, is I'll just scale them very slowly on the Z-axis, but still have some pivots enabled so the object can rotate itself, but still be squashed on this one axis. This gives a very, very nice visual cohesion with the player being a 2D sprite and then turning into this 3D object, having the 3D object still have this level of squished visuals to it and still look kind of flat compared to the regular player. Is there any reason to do this? Would anybody notice aside from me if I just didn't scale the object? Probably. I'm a big fan of how this looks. I think it gives a very nice little toony visual to the actual snowball itself. If you're wondering why I didn't just use a regular animated snowball and make it 2D like the character is 2D and hand-drawn, it is because I really wanted the snowball to be able to rotate around, and figuring out how to draw frames for that was too confusing, so I just made a sphere and made it snowy. When the player breaks, they make a snowball effect. This is also quite interesting. As you may have noticed, depending on the snowball's size, the effect is different. All I do for this is I will change the radius of the particle effect that creates the snowball breaking, and I will create the number of particles the snowball effect will create based on the size of the snowball itself. So at a size of 1, I will create maybe 12 particles. At a size of 50, I will create 1 billion particles. At a size of 5, I will create 30 particles. This gives the real impression of the snow breaking and there just being more snow because more particles are being made. And that is it for Devlog. In my tier list ranking of spells usefulness to non-usefulness to fun to unfun, the snow creates a very, very firm position in fun and useless. I cannot think of very many puzzles in my game that being a giant snowball will be able to solve. Maybe a couple to gain height in specific circumstances, but realistically, this is another funny one. Despite requiring a whole new set of collision datas and geometry calculations and different movement values, the snowball was pretty simple to code for. I'm a huge fan of how it turned out, even if the snowball mechanic so far has only really served a purpose to showcase some weird oddity my game is able to do when I post on social media. With the addition of another elemental mechanic, I now only have maybe 4 elements to code for, these being sticky, soapy, a third one, and a 4th one. I've really lost track of which elements I have and have not planned for. And since I code faster than I animate, the actual runes I have left to add to the game are only about 9, which means the prototype's almost done, baby.